This is the Fujifilm XM5, and it's one of the most interesting cameras I've tried in years. Not because it is the best at any one particular thing, but because it combines a lot of elements that are usually reserved for cameras that are larger and more expensive. There is a lot packed into this tiny camera body, which is also why I think I am slightly conflicted about this camera. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through my experience with this camera over the last 3 weeks, and we will find out together if Fujifilm has continued to push the small camera category forward. We're going to cover Fuji's design decisions, the overall image quality, my personal usability experience for both video and stills. I'll compare the XM5 to other cameras available. Then at the end, I'll talk about who this camera is for. This video is sponsored by Artlist, more on them a bit later. Typically, when talking about the physical design of a camera these days, you don't get a lot of surprises. However, with the XM5, Fuji has made quite a few notable decisions worth talking about. Let's start with the most noticeable thing. This camera is tiny. At first, this feels like a great thing because the smaller the camera, the easier it is to bring around. However, I feel like we may have reached the limit in terms of how small a camera with this sensor size should be. I don't have large hands, but even for me, the XM5 is not that comfortable to hold onto by itself. With just the camera alone, you will start to get cramping in your hand in no time. Now, that isn't even where the size issues stop, but I'll get back to that a bit later when we talk about the experience. Let's move on for now to the other weird design decisions because there is something to look at on every side of this camera. On the top of the camera, we have the mode selection dial, a custom settings dial, the shutter button, a record button for video, the tiniest Q button ever, and probably the most dividing choice, the film simulation dial. After using this during my testing, I don't like this dial. On the surface, I do see what Fuji was trying to do here. Film simulations are arguably the main draw for their cameras, especially for people who have never owned any other camera. This dial is just not that useful. For starters, I think once you play around with the many different film simulations, you will likely settle on 2 to 3 that are your go-to simulations for most things. This means you probably won't be switching between film simulations once you figure out which ones you like the most. Adding to this, I think Fuji missed the one opportunity they had to make this dial useful, and that's film simulation recipes. For anyone who hasn't shot a Fuji before, a film simulation recipe is just a specific combination of in-camera settings that affect the look of your JPEGs. This gives you a specific feel to your colors, texture, and contrast, so you don't have to do that in editing. Here's the issue. If, for example, you have a recipe that you like for Reala Ace and a slightly different one for Classic Chrome, you can't set each one individually when you move between the film simulation on this dial. Put differently, if I've done the work to find the perfect recipe for a particular film simulation, then I change modes to a different film simulation with this dial, the recipe settings I set most recently apply to every film simulation, no matter which one on the dial you are set to. So if there are differences between recipes that you like, you have to go in and change them manually for every simulation. This is the biggest missed opportunity of this dial. If each simulation had its own settings independent of each other, this dial might actually be useful. Moving on to the bottom of the camera, we have an offset /20 mount. This is slightly annoying since if you use a tripod plate on this camera, you will need to take it off to remove the battery or change out the SD card. The grip side of the camera has the majority of the I/O, which is a headphone jack, Type-C port for data and power, and a micro HDMI. It seems like Fuji did this for 2 reasons. 1, so that the on-camera display has unobstructed mobility, and 2, so the I/O doesn't get in the way when you want to film yourself and see the screen at the same time. I'll admit, at first, I thought a lot of these physical design decisions were pretty annoying. At the same time, if you were designing a camera this small for beginners and people who like simplicity, these are the kinds of trade-offs that are made. I also found with a few key accessories, most of my gripes with the physical design are fairly easily solved. I'll dive more into the setup I used during my testing a bit later. Now let's talk about the XM5's image quality. This camera is using the previous generation X-Trans4 sensor seen in cameras like the X100V and the Fuji X-T4, which I actually still own. Pairing this sensor with the updated processor in some of Fuji's newer cameras makes for a really compelling combination. The most unique feature of the XM5's recording modes is definitely the 6.2K open gate recording. For anyone unaware, open gate simply means that you're able to record the entire width and height of the sensor instead of recording only standard video formats like 16:9. This is mainly useful in situations where you want to record for both horizontal and vertical video with a single recording. If you're a beginner, Fuji offers a dedicated vlog mode that has its own separate touch menu, allowing you to take advantage of what this camera can do without needing to know how to balance your settings manually. Background defocus for a one-button shallow depth of field, product priority for when you want to hold something in front of the camera and you want it to be in focus, and perhaps the most useful, a dedicated 9:16 movie mode for vertical video. The 9:16 mode is particularly interesting since it crops the footage for you in camera while allowing you to select a 15, 30, or 60-second timing for your recording. This makes it relatively streamlined to shoot nearly ready-to-post vertical video with Fuji's film simulations applied. The caveat to this mode is it's capped at 1080p, which I assume is just a limitation for all of these things to happen in camera. I'm also personally not a fan of shooting Fuji's film simulations baked into video because it limits your dynamic range, and even with the auto exposure settings being solid, if your exposure is off for some reason, you are more limited on your options to fix it later. Though, if you're someone who is more focused on just getting your content shot and posted as efficiently as possible, you will likely enjoy these features. If you are or you want to take a more professional approach with this camera, the XM5 has a lot to offer. It benefits from F-Log 2, which I've been using on my X-H2S for years now. This is a clear upgrade from the original F-Log used on the Fujifilm X-T4, despite the sensor being the same. The color you can get from F-Log 2 when it is properly exposed looks awesome. Despite the XM5 only shooting up to 200 megabit H.265 to a single SD card, I think it would generally be pretty difficult to discern this camera's image from my more expensive X-H2S. When I was looking at the cameras side by side, I could not at all tell the difference between them in F-Log 2 and the same lighting. When color grading footage from the XM5, it almost feels hard to believe that it came from a camera that has a smaller footprint than most smartphones. There are a few recording modes that are the exception to this though. The high-speed recording mode, which impressively goes all the way up to 240 FPS in 1080p, is just okay. Don't expect amazing results from the slow motion recording. It's probably still better that it has the option versus not. I just wouldn't personally use it that much myself. Overall, the image from the XM5 definitely does not disappoint, and is probably one of the strongest reasons to consider this camera, because getting an image of this level from something this compact is really fun. As good as the images are, the XM5 is not without a few flaws. Namely the lack of in-body stabilization, which by itself isn't even the main issue in my mind. It's the fact that the available digital stabilization is quite bad. Okay, this is a test of the onboard mic of the XM5. I have it set to front priority right now. I'm using the 16-50 Fujifilm, or 16-55 Fujifilm lens, and the digital image stabilization is currently off. Okay, so this is a second vlogging test. I have the digital image stabilization on. I'm actually recording into my Comica mic, that was the shotgun mic on top of the camera, and you guys can be the judge whether you think I'm just walking along this path, whether you think the stabilization and the audio sounds okay. This is kind of what a typical vlogging setup would probably look like with this camera. Even for completely static handheld shots, I was still left with disappointing results from the digital image stabilization. Footage looks warpy and wobbly, even with rather slight movement. This reminds me of bad Premiere Pro warp stabilizer circa 2010, when everyone was stabilizing DSLR shots, which were notoriously bad for having rolling shutter artifacts. My recommendation here is to generally avoid the DIS, because not only does it give you a 1.32 crop, I think more often than not you will ruin your footage versus just stabilizing a shot in post, or finding a more effective setup to get better organic handheld footage. The main issue here is the same problem that anyone who shoots video with a hybrid camera has always had to face. The body is too small to get steady handheld easily. When you don't have IBIS or a stabilized lens, this will always be a trade-off. The bigger the camera, the easier it is to get steady handheld. I shot some content on the XM5 for S&R Denim Co., a local Vancouver company that makes really nice aprons. We had about 8 hours in their shop one day, and I shot the majority of this video handheld. When you build out a proper handheld setup for the XM5, the lack of IBIS isn't really a big deal. As someone who spent the first half of my career with cameras that do not have IBIS, it's a compromise I would happily make even today if I was a beginner who wanted a pro level image for less than $1,000. If you're a professional and you already own a handheld rig for a mirrorless camera, then you have a super viable option to shoot some great stuff with the XM5. The foundation of the setup I used with the XM5 was this cage from SmallRig. I view this as almost an essential accessory because it's a simple solution that solves quite a few problems at the same time. For starters, it gives you a much more significant grip that will not hurt your hands if you're shooting for long periods of time. I even found that despite the annoying grip side I/O, even when you have a Type-C cable plugged in while shooting, it's possible to grip the camera in a way that isn't super uncomfortable. The bottom of the cage also adds a built-in Arca Swiss plate and fixes the positioning of the Q20 mounts on the bottom of the camera so they are properly centered with multiple points of contact to screw into. Once you add a cage like this, using the XM5 for professional video work feels very possible. I was pleasantly surprised to see that when running a Type-C cable off a V-mount, it allowed me to keep the XM5 powered all day without needing to swap out the in-camera battery even once. Even when powering other accessories, I did the entire 8-hour shoot on a single 99 watt-hour V-mount. I also didn't run into any overheating issues throughout this shoot. However, if you're going to run fairly long takes for say an interview, overheating is definitely still a limitation to consider with this camera. Now you may be thinking, this is great. I don't need IBIS. This camera is super affordable. It's a great option as a budget cinema camera. I don't fully disagree with you, but you should definitely be aware of a few quirks that I encountered. Let's start with the controls. The XM5 is fairly limited on buttons, but they are all remappable, and when combined with the touch functions, you should be able to get quick access to every setting you'd need on the fly, with no help from the almost impossible to press Q button. Where things get slightly more frustrating is in subtle issues with the menu. For example, despite having a dedicated vertical mode, the UI on the XM5 in video never rotates when the camera is set up vertically. This is really strange to me because in stills mode, the UI does adjust vertically without an issue, but the moment you hit record in video, it goes back to landscape. I also had a really frustrating time configuring the custom modes in the XM5. The custom mode setting that allows you to choose whether a custom mode is video or stills by default is buried deep on page 4 of the settings, which is not intuitive. It's not even accessible from every mode on the mode dial. On top of that, I ran into a problem with the camera not allowing recording at the beginning of my shoot. The reason for this ended up being the shoot without lens setting, which was turned off. This meant that the moment I put on a manual lens, the camera would not capture stills or video and gave me no prompt as to why. This is minor once you have found this setting, but this could easily lead to a lot of frustration and wasted time if you don't know it exists. I don't think this is an XM5 specific problem since there are other Fujifilm cameras with this setting. I just think that Fuji should just remove it altogether. All of these little quality of life quirks are a reminder that this is not a professional video camera. So while the XM5 can produce a professional level image, it's clearly not designed to be used this way, but I was impressed overall nonetheless. I think in the right hands, it is perfectly capable of professional level work, but you will be dealing with a lot of caveats if you try to force it to do that job. When it comes to casual handheld shooting, I do think most people are going to need a stabilization solution for this camera. Whether that's a handheld vlogging tripod or some larger grips on the camera to help you improve the center of gravity. If the lack of IBIS is a deal breaker for you, you should probably consider either a used camera with IBIS at this price point or something higher up in Fuji's lineup. The last thing I want to touch on when it comes to the experience is photography. The image quality from the stills is what you'd expect from basically any Fujifilm camera. Excellent color, great native lens selection, and excellent detail. Here's the problem. I personally don't like shooting stills on this camera. So while the images are as good as you would ever want, the lack of EVF paired with the camera being this tiny makes this a much less enjoyable stills experience versus almost any other Fujifilm camera. All I wanted to do was put this camera to my eye every time I took a still, but I couldn't. Pair that with the less intentional feeling dials, and you don't really get the Fujifilm photography experience with this camera. I think if Fujifilm made an external EVF accessory like the one Leica makes for its rangefinders, this camera would be a much better stills experience if you're like me and prefer an EVF for stills. Yes, there are other Fujifilm cameras like the X-T30 Mark II, which are small and have an EVF, which is probably why Fuji will never make an EVF accessory for this camera, but that doesn't make me want an EVF for the XM5 any less. For stills then, it will probably come down to whether or not you value the quality of the images more than you value the experience of using the camera. If you just want Fujifilm images, the XM5 delivers. If you want the effortless, fun shooting experience Fuji is known for, this might not be the best choice. When we look at the current market of new cameras, the Sony ZV-E10 II, Nikon Z52, and even Fujifilm's X-T30 Mark II are all reasonably comparable to the XM5 in terms of price and relative features. Here's the thing though, I don't think you should buy a camera based on price or features. Those are important, but they aren't the most important question. The main thing to focus on, in my opinion, is your answer to this. What am I going to do with this camera the majority of the time? I've owned and used a lot of cameras over my 13-year career. Many of them were and are hybrid cameras. However, despite being hybrid, I always used a camera 90% of the time either for stills or video. The use has never been 50-50. I have never owned a camera where I loved the experience of both equally. There is always a trade-off when the use case is split. I think this is a huge reason why purpose-built cameras like the X100VI are so popular. It's intentional. It gives you the experience you want to have when shooting stills. You're more focused on the medium you are shooting, so most of your mental energy goes to the work you're using the camera for in the first place, whether that's stills or video. With the XM5 specifically, this camera is very capable for video, especially if you are a creator. While it is no slouch for stills, it lacks the Fujifilm photography experience that they are so well known for, and that's okay, because I think it fulfills the intention that it was designed for. I imagine because the X100VI is so difficult to get even today, you might be considering the XM5 as a compact camera. It's definitely a reasonable alternative, but it's not going to give you the same experience necessarily. Just keep that in mind. If you're deciding between multiple cameras in the same category as the XM5, think about the experience you want to have. Is the camera for fun? Is it for work? What do you care more about? Stills or video? Every camera is part of a larger ecosystem of lenses and other support gear, so think about the system that offers what you want the most long term. If making videos for social media is one of your intentions for a camera like the XM5, then you will also need a great place to get assets for your videos, like the sponsor of today's video, Artlist. I've been using Artlist since 2016 when they first launched, and it really is impressive how many things they've added to their platform since then. They recently launched their new tools category. Here's how it works. You can now install an Artlist library extension to seamlessly integrate everything Artlist has to offer into Premiere Pro. This means that you don't have to leave your editing software in order to find the perfect music or sound effects for whatever is in your timeline. The timeline sync feature allows you to preview how something will sound with your video without needing to constantly drag and drop different audio files onto your timeline, which will save you a lot of time and effort. Another addition is the AI assistant, which helps with unwanted silences in your timeline. So instead of spending hours manually going into your new recording to just remove pauses and gaps, you can do all of this with just a few clicks. On top of that, the AI assistant can also auto zoom in on key moments of your video for emphasis when you are speaking. Both of these features have advanced parameters so you can tweak them to get exactly what you want quickly. The tools category also has over 50 easy to use plugins that you can just drop onto your footage. If you want an extra 2 months free with an annual subscription to Artlist, you can check out the first link in the video description. Thank you to Artlist for making this video possible. Now let's discuss who I think the XM5 is for. Personally, I'm slightly conflicted with the XM5. On the one hand, the images are amazing and it really is packed with features at a solid price. That being said, it doesn't quite capture the Fujifilm experience that cameras like my X-T4 and the X100VI deliver on. If you want a camera that you will love taking with you everywhere because of how frictionless the experience is, the XM5 may miss the mark for you slightly. There are two groups of people who I think will get the most value out of the XM5. If you are an aspiring creator who wants to make content on social media, this camera is a solid entry to the Fujifilm ecosystem. It will probably inspire you to get better at using a camera constantly, simply due to how capable it is. If you are a seasoned professional, this might be a fun, casual camera that has the ability to capture a more polished look if you want to put in the effort to work around the trade-offs. The XM5 can play as a C camera for situations where you'd need multiple cameras on a shoot. Regardless of the quirks, I think Fujifilm is going to sell a lot of these cameras. 10 years into the future, I predict the XM5 is going to be a cult classic that is remembered for being a camera that is really capable in an extremely tiny package. If you found this video helpful and you want another camera to compare it to, you can watch my recent video on the Sony ZV-E10 II to compare the differences between them for yourself.